A lonely teacher adopted a boy who didn't speak until one day. What if the loudest story was buried in silence? Years after a tragedy silenced her classroom and her heart, Edeline, a once beloved teacher, now lives alone in a forgotten prairie house. The world moved on without her, and she let it. That is, until one cold morning, a boy appears by her fence barefoot, voiceless, and carrying a silence deeper than her own. He never speaks, but he never leaves. And in that wordless bond, Edeline begins to remember who she once was, and wonders if healing could come not through talking but through staying. But when the past knocks again, demanding the boy be taken, one word will decide everything, a word neither of them thought they could say again. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches something quiet in you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. The ending might just whisper something you've been needing to hear. The teacher who forgot her name. They used to call her Teacher. Back when the bell rang every morning and little feet scrambled into the old wooden schoolhouse by the wheat fields. Back when her name still meant something, written in chalk across a board that had seen too many seasons fade into dust. Her name was Edeline Harper. Once, she was the kind of teacher who knew which child needed an extra sandwich and which one read to escape. She stayed after class for the quiet one. She wrote long, careful notes in red ink, always gentle, never scolding. Then came the fall. One boy, Caleb M., tripped during recess. He'd been running too fast, chasing someone or something, and he fell hard against the stone steps. His wrist broke. It wasn't her fault. Everyone said so. The school board didn't punish her. The parents didn't complain. But Edeline, she never forgave herself. She stopped coming in, didn't show up the next Monday, didn't answer the letters, just disappeared. When she left, she took almost nothing: a tattered satchel, a few lesson plans, the classroom's old slate board, and her roll book. That roll book still had all the names of the children she'd taught, names she once called out with purpose. All except one. Caleb M. His name had been crossed out, not with a gentle line, but with a jagged, angry stroke of red ink. No one knew if Edeline had done it, or if she simply couldn't bear to see it and someone else had done it for her. Now, she lives in a house far from the town she once belonged to, out past the gravel roads, near the fence line where the wind has long since stopped whispering. Each morning, Edeline still makes 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one for the student who never comes. She sets 2 places at her tiny wooden table, but only one is ever used. She still teaches, too, in her own strange way. She writes lessons on the blackboard at dusk. Simple things, words about stars, about forgiveness, about verbs and birds. She writes them slowly, carefully. Then she erases them the next morning. No one sees them but her. But maybe that's enough. The townspeople call her the woman on the edge of the wheat. They say she talks to ghosts. They say she never recovered. And maybe they're right, because the hardest thing about regret is that it doesn't ask for company. It just settles in, soft and silent, until even your own name starts to fade. And for Edeline, the name Teacher became a whisper that only the wind remembered. Until, one quiet afternoon, the wind changed. The day the fence moved. The fence hadn't moved in years. It stood like everything else around Edeline's house, tired, silent, and stubborn in its stillness. She'd stopped expecting visitors long ago. No mailman came this far out. No children played near the wheat line. The only tracks in the dust were her own, and the wind's quoting. But that morning, something was different. There were footprints, small ones, bare, uncertain, but undeniably human. They led from the woods right up to the sagging gate, like a whisper daring to be heard again. Edeline stared at them for a while, kettle still steaming in her hands. There was no fear, just that old, worn feeling in her chest that tightened any time the past came knocking in strange ways. She didn't investigate. She didn't call out into the wood. She simply walked back into her house and for the first time in years left the door unlocked. It wasn't a grand gesture, just quiet permission, a silent offering. If you're cold, come in. If you're hungry, sit. If you're tired of running, here's a place to stop. That afternoon, he came. A boy, thin, dusty, maybe 7 or 8. His clothes hung off him like they'd once belonged to someone else. His hair stuck out in wild tufts, and his eyes, they were empty, the kind of empty that doesn't come from sadness, but from forgetting what it's like to be seen. He didn't speak, didn't step forward, just stood there, right outside the gate, watching her through the slat. Edelin didn't ask his name, didn't ask where he'd come from. She just poured a second cup of tea and set it on the table across from hers. The boy didn't move, but as the sun dropped behind the hills, she saw a flicker of something just for a moment in his eyes. That night, the second cup was empty. She found the mug beside the front step, clean and carefully placed. The next morning, she left the door wide open, not as an invitation in words, but something softer, something simpler, the kind of welcome that doesn't ask questions, doesn't demand explanations. And maybe that's exactly what he needed. On the third night, she heard the floorboards creak. When she peeked into the parlor, he was there curled on the rug beside the fire, already asleep, a wool coat bundled beneath his head like a makeshift pillow. Edelin didn't say a word. She draped a quilt over him, added a log to the fire, and sat nearby for a while just watching the shadows flicker on the walls. It had been so long since someone had accepted her silence, since someone had answered her loneliness with their own. And as she watched, the boy breathed soft, even unafraid. She realized something she hadn't dared believe in years. Maybe the heart doesn't need grand speeches. Maybe it doesn't need closure or confession. Maybe, sometimes, the most powerful way to open up is to simply leave the door unlocked. She stayed there for a long time that night, listening to the fire crackle and pop an old, comforting sound that used to mean the end of another school day. Back then, she would sit in an empty classroom, grading papers long after the sun dipped behind the trees, content in the presence of possibility. Now, she watched the boy, asleep on her floor, and something in her softened not in a dramatic, storybook way, but in that quiet, invisible shift only a wounded heart could notice. She didn't know his name, didn't know his past, and somehow that made it easier. They were both nameless here, both lost, both waiting for someone to tell them they were allowed to stay. Edelin didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the boy would still be there, whether he would speak or leave or vanish like a dream. But she did know this. Tonight, the house wasn't empty. Tonight, the fence had moved. And maybe, just maybe, something inside her had, too. A cup, a quilt, and quiet eyes. By the end of the first week, it was clear he wasn't planning to leave. Not that either of them said it, not that it was agreed upon or even acknowledged. But in the soft way the days began to fill in, Edelin noticed something had changed, something in the light that filtered through the windows, something in the weight of footsteps no longer echoing alone. Each morning, the blanket she'd left over him was folded, not messily or in a hurry, folded with care. She'd taught that kind of fold once, years ago, to a girl who wanted to work in hotels. The memory of it made her chest tighten just a little, and the cups she'd only ever used one for years. But now, each morning, 2 cups were placed on the table before she made it downstairs. One hers, one plain and chipped at the rim. He never joined her at first. Just sat outside on the porch or by the window, hands tucked into his sleeves, staring into the distance like the world had already ended. But he was there, and his presence, however quiet, began to press itself into the fabric of the house. He didn't speak, not a word, but his movements spoke plenty. He swept the entryway one afternoon without being asked. Later, she saw the firewood stacked a little neater by the door, and when she came in with muddy boots, there was already a towel waiting near the threshold. There were no thank yous, no praises, just shared space, and the subtle shifting of loneliness making room for someone else. She started baking again, not out of habit, but because the boy had lingered a second too long near the oven the night before. She pretended not to notice how quickly he ate, how he didn't seem to believe the food was really meant for him. But she made more the next day anyway. Bit by bit, he mirrored her. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't follow her around or ask questions or even make eye contact for long, but his mug faced the same direction hers did. He folded the dish towel the same odd way she did, thirds and then a triangle. She'd caught him once watching her, then turning away quickly when she noticed. It reminded her of her students, the quiet ones, the ones who never raised their hands but got every answer right, the ones who just wanted someone to notice they were trying. She left a book on the table, a simple reader, the kind they gave to third graders. Nothing fancy, just an old friend, really. She didn't say it was for him, didn't push it closer, just placed it there. Later, it had moved. Barely. A shift in angle. A page creased in a way she hadn't left it. She didn't mention it, just smiled, faintly, behind her tea. The house had been still for so long, too still. Stillness could be peaceful, yes, but it could also be a kind of death. Now, the air held motion, soft noises, the creak of floorboards not from age, but from life. And the silence between them? It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of what hadn't yet been said, but didn't need to be not yet. She started humming again. It was quiet at first, just under her breath while slicing carrots or while lighting the lamp at dusk. Little tunes she'd nearly forgotten, school songs, hymns, things from a life she had let slip away. Once, when she paused near the door, she heard him mimic one note off-key and barely audible, but she didn't look back. She let him pretend she hadn't heard. It was a fragile trust they were building, like trying to teach a wild animal that it's safe to eat from your hand. But that's the thing about trust. It doesn't come with declarations. It shows up in the smallest of acts, a folded quilt, a poured cup, a glance that lingers a second longer than the last. She wondered if he even knew how much he was giving, how every action, every mirrored motion was saying, "I see you. I remember how you move. I'm learning you." And maybe that was all she'd ever wanted from anyone. The world had gotten loud without meaning. People talked so much and said so little. But this boy gave her silence that felt honest. It didn't demand anything. It didn't accuse. It just existed beside the hairs. At night, when she turned out the lantern, she often paused to listen. 2 sets of footsteps, 2 cups left in the basin, a second breath beside her own, and it comforted her more than any conversation ever could. One evening, as dusk swallowed the last bit of color from the prairie sky, he stood behind her while she lit the fire. Just stood there, close, but not too close. After a moment, she handed him the matchbox without turning. He took it, lit the log, watched the flame catch, and when she looked at him, really looked, his eyes weren't afraid anymore. Still quiet, yes, still guarded, but no longer empty. Something had settled in him, maybe not safety. Not yet, but something close. She didn't reach for him. He didn't speak. They just watched the fire flicker in silence, her hands resting on her knees, his arms wrapped around his own frame, still unsure if he belonged, but beginning to believe maybe he did. And in that small, flickering moment, Edelyn realized something simple and soul-deep. That healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes like this, in cups, in kilt, in quiet eyes that finally learn how to stay. The blackboard word. The blackboard stood like a monument to a life left behind. It leaned in the corner of the kitchen where the sun rarely reached, streaked with time and covered in a dull layer of chalk dust. Edelyn hadn't written on it in months, maybe even longer. It wasn't that she forgot it was there. She passed it every day, sometimes glancing at the faint grammar rules still clinging to the surface. Past participles are formed by the sentence trailed off, unfinished, as if her hand had stopped mid-thought and never found its way back. The truth was, she didn't have anything left to write. She'd once used that board to explain the world. Letters, verbs, little drawings of the solar system for curious minds. She'd taught fractions to fidgety boys and poems to girls who doodled hearts in the margin. She remembered the sound of chalk tapping lightly, the squeak that made kids groan, the laughter, the stillness when a story held them all in place. Now the board was just furniture, a thing she didn't dare touch because it reminded her of who she used to be. Until that morning, she came downstairs with the same slow steps she always took, joints stiff from the dampness in the air. The boy had been there for nearly 2 weeks now, and they'd fallen into a pattern, silent, peaceful, and tender, in a way she never expected to experience again. She expected silence. She expected the soft click of the kettle warming on the stove, maybe the quiet clink of a cup already placed on the table, as he often did now. Maybe the boy himself, perched by the window, watching the breeze move through the tall grass. What she didn't expect was the scent of chalk. It wasn't strong, just faint enough to pull her eyes toward the corner. And then she saw it. The blackboard was clean. Someone had taken a cloth, wet it, wiped it, dried it. The old sentence was gone. All the faded scribbles from months past, gone. It gleamed, black and still slightly damp at the edges. But in the center, written in large, uneven, careful strokes, was a single word: teacher. Her breath caught. Her hand rose slowly to her mouth, like she could catch the moment before it escaped her. The letters weren't perfect. The T tilted slightly forward. The R curled too far in. The spacing was tight in some places, wide in others. But it was unmistakable. He had written it. No one else could have lacked it. Her eyes searched the floor instinctively, as if she might find his footprint still there, evidence of his approach. But the room was still, just the blackboard and that one soul-shaking word. She stepped forward slowly, as though afraid the chalk might smudge just by her breath. Her fingers itched to reach for it, to trace the letters like they were carved from something sacred, but she didn't. She just stood there, letting the word settle into her like a prayer. Teacher. She hadn't heard that word in years, not spoken aloud, not in letters, not even in memory. She had erased herself from it, convinced she no longer deserved it. Not after Caleb, not after what happened in that schoolyard. But here it was, not as a title, not as a label, but as a gift, from a boy who didn't speak, from a boy who hadn't said a single word since the moment he appeared at her fence. Her knees trembled. She lowered herself slowly into the kitchen chair, eyes still fixed on the board. She imagined him standing there, chalk clutched tightly in his little hand. Maybe he practiced the word first somewhere else. Maybe he traced it in the dirt before he dared put it on the board. Maybe it took him hours to build up the courage. But he had done it. He had called her something no one had called her in so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to wear the name. She didn't hear him come in, but when she looked up, he was standing in the doorway, barefoot, shirt hanging loose at the shoulder, hands fidgeting slightly at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just watched her. She didn't cry right away. Not in front of him. She nodded, once, slow and grateful. He stepped forward, just a little. His eyes dropped to the floor, like he didn't know if he'd done something right or wrong. You wrote it, she whispered, unsure if he could hear. You remembered. He looked up then, just briefly, long enough for her to see it. Trust, not full-blown, not unbreakable, but real, cautious, uncertain, but real. She rose from the chair and walked toward the board. For a moment, she stood beside him close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin, but not enough to startle him. With slow hands, she picked up the chalk he had left on the edge of the board. Underneath his crooked teacher, she added one word more. Yes. He stared at it, blinked, and for the first time, something flickered across his face. Not a smile, but the echo of one. Then he turned and quietly padded out of the room. She didn't follow. She stayed by the board, staring at the two words standing side by side. Teacher. Yes. Simple. Holy. Enough. Because in that single word, he had done what no one else could. He had named her again. He had told her, I see you. I know who you are. You still matter. And for someone like Edelin, that was more healing than any apology, more powerful than any speech. Because when you've spent your life fading into silence, all it takes is one person, just one, to write your name back into the world. And suddenly, you begin to believe in yourself again, not as who you were, but as who you still might be. Dust and footsteps from the past. It was the kind of morning that felt too quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that made the birds seem late, the breeze too still, like even the air was bracing for something. Edelyn had just finished sweeping the porch when she saw him. A truck, dust-colored, engine idling low, pulled up along the crooked fence line. She didn't recognize it. Didn't recognize the man either. Mid-40s, hard jaw, eyes that scanned everything like he expected it to break. He stepped out slow, like he owned whatever space he stood in. She knew trouble when it wore boots that clean. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat, though there was nothing polite in his tone. "Name's Walker. I'm looking for a boy." Every muscle in her body tensed, but her voice stayed even. "Plenty of boys in the world. You'll need to be more specific." He smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, just sure of himself. He pulled a paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "I'm his guardian. Got the court documents right here." Her eyes scanned the crumpled form. It had a name, the boy's, no photo, a county stamp, official enough to make her chest tighten. Walker glanced over her shoulder toward the house. "He's been gone near 2 months now. Folks think he wandered off. He does that sometimes. I figured maybe some do-gooder scooped him up. Looks like I was right." His voice had the kind of calm that made your skin crawl, like someone who'd told too many lies and started believing them. Edelyn didn't say anything. She handed the paper back, slow. "I'll need to take him today," he said. She nodded just barely. "He's inside." But she didn't move. Instead, she turned and walked in through the front door, heart pounding like the school bell in a fire drill. She found the boy in the back room, the old study she hadn't used in years, now his. He was crouched in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees, breathing fast. He'd heard everything. Her eyes flicked to the little desk by the wall. The drawing they'd made together yesterday was there, or what was left of it. It had been torn down the center, the smiling stick figures of him and her now split, jagged. Next to it, in thick, shaky letters, he'd scrawled over a loose sheet of lined paper, "I don't want to go." 3 words. That was all. But they shook her deeper than anything she'd ever read. She knelt slowly, not touching him, not even getting too close. "You don't have to," she said softly. "Not yet. Just breathe." He didn't look at her, but he didn't run either. Outside, the man's boots scraped on the steps. Edelyn stood. She wasn't sure what she was going to say or do. She just knew something old was rising in her chest, something sharp and ancient and tied to another name, Caleb. That day in the schoolyard had never left her. The boy she didn't protect. The silence she let win. Would she do it again? Let another child walk away because she was too afraid to fight? Walker was already halfway through the door when she stopped him. "He doesn't want to go," she said. Walker raised an eyebrow. "He's a minor. Wants don't matter. Legal does." She took a breath, long and slow. "I'd like to speak with the sheriff first," she said, voice firm now. "And until then, I'd ask you to wait outside my house." Something flickered in his expression, just a twitch, enough to know he hadn't expected her to stand tall. "I've got papers," he reminded her. "And I've got a child who hasn't spoken a word in 2 months," she replied. "But today he wrote something. That means more to me than your papers." He stared at her for a long time, then, without a word, he turned and walked back out to his truck. She watched from the window as he sat behind the wheel, jaw clenched, engine still idling. The boy appeared beside her, small hand slipping quietly into hers. For the first time, he chose contact. They stood like that for several minutes, no words, no movement. Just stillness and a shared heartbeat between 2 people who had both been left behind too many times. And in that moment, Edelyn understood what real love looked like. Not perfect, not clean, but fierce, unflinching, and rooted in the decision to stay, even when every part of you wants to run. She didn't know what would happen next. The man might come back with the sheriff. The papers might be real, or not, but she knew this much. She wouldn't let the boy go, not unless someone pried him from her arm, not unless he chose it, not unless love had a better home than this one. Because the people who are hurt the most, they're often the ones most afraid to be loved. And the only thing stronger than fear is someone who refuses to walk away. What if he leaves me too? That night, Edelyn didn't sleep. She didn't even try. She sat by the door, wrapped in her worn wool shawl, staring at the porch lamp that flickered against the wind, casting long shadows across the room. Her teacup had gone cold hours ago, untouched on the side table. Every sound in the house felt louder than it should have. The soft groan of old floorboards, the hush of wind pushing against the window panes, the ghost of a clock ticking in a room no longer used. The boy was asleep, or at least lying still. He hadn't spoken, not after what happened that morning. But something in his eyes had shifted when she told the man no, something like disbelief, as if no one had ever stood between him and harm before. And yet, even after she stood her ground, Edelyn couldn't quiet the storm inside her. What if it wasn't enough? What if he left anyway? What if someone showed up with more papers, louder voices, stronger claim? What if, after everything, she lost him too? She didn't cry. The tears had already come and gone. Now there was just the ache, a silent, steady weight that pressed into her chest with every breath. Outside, the prairie was dark and wide, and she imagined it swallowing everything she'd rebuilt, her fragile peace, the flickers of trust between her and the boy, even the word he'd written on the blackboard. Teacher. How could one word feel like everything she'd ever wanted, and everything she was afraid to lose? She thought about Caleb, the boy who used to sit in the front row, hands always a little too clean, voice too quiet. He'd stayed after class sometimes, not because he needed help, but because he didn't want to go home. She hadn't seen the bruises right away. No one had. And when he disappeared, taken by a man who claimed to be kin, papers in hand and urgency in his step, she'd watched him go, trusting the process, the authority, the idea that someone else knew better. She hadn't slept for 3 nights after that. And then, one day, she found Caleb's name in a news article. Buried. Brief. No charges had been filed. There was nothing she could do, but the guilt had never left. And now, here she was again. A boy. A paper. A decision. Only this time, she had said no. Only this time, she had stood still. But still, the question echoed in her chest louder than ever. What if I lose him too? The porch light buzzed softly, fighting the night. She remembered standing at the window as a child, watching her father return from town, how she used to count the headlights on the road, imagining every beam was him. And now, here she was, full-grown, grown old, waiting again not for someone to arrive, but praying someone wouldn't leave. She didn't know when the boy began to feel like something more than a guest. Maybe it was the morning he poured her tea without being asked. Maybe it was the moment he stood behind her as she lit the fire, silent but present. Maybe it was the word on the blackboard. Maybe it was all of it, layer upon layer of quiet, simple gestures. So many little things no one else would have noticed. But she did, because she had once lived in a world full of noise and still felt invisible. That's what broke her the most. The fear that this boy, too, might vanish into that same silence. The fear that all of this, the tea, the folded quilts, the almost smile on his face might have been temporary, like spring rain that warms the earth just before frost returns. She whispered into the dark, "If I lose him, what's left?" It wasn't dramatic, just a breath of truth, cracked and hollow, spoken to the night as if it might echo back an answer. But it didn't, because no answer could soothe that ache. She wasn't just protecting him anymore. She was protecting herself, because for all the strength she tried to wear like armor, Edelyn knew what it felt like to be abandoned, to be left behind not by force, but by silence, by people who didn't think you were worth staying for. The wind picked up, rattling the window latches. She pulled her shawl tighter, and still, she waited. For what? She didn't know. Maybe for sleep. Maybe for the boy to come downstairs. Maybe for the courage to believe she could keep loving something without losing it. And then soft as a dream she heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, not hurried, just the bare, careful steps of someone testing the floor. She turned. Slowly. He stood in the hall, wrapped in his blanket, hair tousled from sleep. One sock on, one off, like he'd left in a hurry. He didn't speak. He never did. But his eyes found hurt, and she saw it. The question, the fear, and beneath it, the answer. She shifted slightly in her chair. He stepped forward, then another step. Then, with no ceremony, no hesitation, he sat in the chair beside her, not on the floor, not on the steps, beside her. She didn't reach for him this time. He did. One small hand, rough and cold, slid over hers, fingers curling with such caution it nearly shattered her. They sat like that for a long time. And slowly, the ache inside her began to ease, not disappear, but ease. Because she knew now, even if just for tonight, he had chosen to stay. And more than that, he had chosen her. It wasn't about legal guardianship or court documents. It wasn't even about word. It was about presence. About showing up again and again, even when it's terrifying. About sitting in the dark, hearts too full of hurt to speak, and still reaching out anyway. That was the lesson she never taught in any classroom. That sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who've had to love without any promise that it would be returned. And sometimes, it's not just the child who needs saving. Sometimes, it's the adult who's been strong too long. The one who waited by doors with cold tea. The one who stood in front of firelight and wondered if anyone would ever choose them back. Tonight, in the hush of a prairie wind, Edelyn understood something her younger self never could. The hardest part of love isn't the giving. It's letting yourself be kept. The word that saved them both. Teacher. The rain came soft and steady that morning, soaking into the thirsty prairie earth with a rhythm like breathing. It tapped against the window panes, against the rusted porch lamp, against the roof that had seen too many storms. But inside the house, the silence was deeper than ever. Edelyn stirred the fire low, moving slowly, gently, as though afraid a sudden noise might disturb the fragile peace they had clung to all night. The boy hadn't gone back to sleep. She knew that. He'd stayed beside her until the sun rose behind the clouds, blanket wrapped around him like armor. There had been no words, no question, just the rhythm of two hearts choosing not to part. And then, as she set a second cup of tea on the table, he looked up. His voice when it came was soft. So soft she almost thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. "Do I have to go?" he asked. 4 words. Simple. Quiet. But they carried the weight of every silence he'd held inside him for weeks, and maybe for years before that. Edelyn's hands froze. The warmth of the cup seeped into her palms, but her chest felt cold. She turned toward him slowly. His face was unreadable, caught somewhere between fear and hope, as though even asking the question might break something too delicate to mend. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over and knelt in front of him, one hand resting gently over his. Then, with her free hand, she lifted his palm and placed it over her own heart. Not a word. Just that. Letting him feel the truth in the way her breath slowed, in the steadiness of the beat beneath his hand. It was all she could offer him now. Not promises, not plans, just presence. Just the knowing that he mattered here, to her. And maybe that was all he needed. The man returned just before noon. Same boots, same papers, same self-sure calm. He stepped through the threshold without waiting for an invitation, and Edelyn did not greet him. She stood, arms folded, between the hallway and the living room where the boy had remained. The man's eyes swept the space like he was taking inventory. "I don't want trouble," he said, "just the kid." Edelyn's chin lifted, but she didn't speak. Then, behind her, there was movement, soft footsteps on the creaky floorboard. The boy stood there, no blanket, no fear, just him, still silent, still watching. The man gestured. "Come on then, time to go." And the boy stepped forward but not toward the door. He moved beside Edelyn, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Then, slowly, he looked the man in the eye and spoke. Only one word. "Teacher." That was all. Not, "I want to stay." Not, "Leave me alone." Not even her name. Just that. Teacher. The man blinked. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe. Discomfort. Even he knew the power of what had just been said. He stood there a moment longer, jaw clenched. Then, with a quiet grunt, he pulled the papers from his coat pocket and dropped them on the table. "Wasn't much use raising him anyway," he muttered. "Didn't talk, didn't listen." And then he left. No threats, no argument, just dust and boot prints fading back down the road. Later that evening, Edelyn found herself standing in front of the blackboard again. The word was still there. Teacher. This time, though, it felt different. It wasn't just something written in chalk. It was a declaration, a name returned, a life reclaimed. He had said it not to describe her, but to protect himself, to define who she had become to him, to tell the world not with argument or defiance, but with truth who she was. And in doing so, he had saved them both. She turned and looked at the boy, curled on the sofa with a book open across his lap. He didn't read it, just held it there, fingers brushing the corners of the pages like he wasn't quite sure he could believe what had happened. She walked over, sat beside him, and this time he leaned into her. No more question, no more doubt, just a quiet understanding between two hearts that had been broken in different ways and now finally fit. Because sometimes one word is all it takes, not to explain everything, not to fix everything, but to choose someone, to say, "You're mine, I'm yours, and here we stay." This is my first class. The season shifted before she noticed. The fields around the house, once brittle and yellowed by summer's dryness, had begun to glow with early autumn gold. The light came softer now, slanting through the windows like honey, warm and slow. The air smelled of paper and wood smoke. And the house had changed. It didn't creak with emptiness anymore. It breathed. There were footsteps now. Chalk dust. The faint rustle of pages turning. The blackboard had returned to use not with grammar rules or multiplication drills, but with stories, names, drawings. Once, the boy wrote a single word in all caps across it, "Home," and beside it, every morning, Edelyn pulled up a second chair. She hadn't planned it. Nothing about this new life was planned. It had unfolded the way a garden does, quietly and without instruction. A seed, a breath, a boy, a second cup of tea. Now, their days fell into a rhythm more natural than anything the school district had ever given her. They studied when the sun was highest, took breaks to walk the fields. He still didn't speak much, but his eyes had softened, and his hands, once balled into fists at every sound, now moved freely over paper and brush. He painted. She hadn't known he could. Watercolors, mostly. Quiet, muted scenes, trees, birds, small cottages tucked into curves of hills. But one day, as she stood by the window arranging a handful of late-blooming daisies into a chipped vase, he tugged gently on her sleeve and held out a new picture. She looked. It was them, her drawn tall, with silver streaks in her hair, eyes soft but alert. Him smaller, grinning slightly, holding a book. Behind them, the blackboard, filled with color. Around them, light. Underneath, in block letters, he had written, "This is my first class." She didn't speak. She just sat down beside him, held the paper in her lap, and traced her finger over the words like they were sacred, because they were. He hadn't just given her a drawing. He had named something neither of them had dared believe. That what they'd built, this small, fragile, healing thing, was real. It was school. It was sanctuary. It was enough. That evening, Edelyn found an envelope buried under a pile of unopened mail. It was from the district. Another letter asking her to return. A position had opened. They still remembered her. Still needed her, they said. The children missed her way with words. Her calm. She held the letter in one hand and the boy's painting in the other. Then, without ceremony, she lit the hearth, struck a match, and watched the envelope curl and blacken in the flame. Not out of anger, not even defiance, but clarity, because she hadn't lost her calling. She had simply moved classrooms. There was no bell, no hallway, no roster, but there was learning here. and love, and more honesty than she'd ever found between four brick walls. She turned and looked at him, asleep now on the floor by the fireplace, his fingers still stained with paint. The quilt barely covered his feet. She pulled it tighter over him, and for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. Her class was here, not in a school building, not in the eyes of administrators or test scores or PTA meeting, but here, in the curve of his smile, in the brushstrokes on paper, in the word teacher written in a child's hand and left hanging in the air like a hymn. There are some classrooms, she thought, that don't come with desks or bells. They come quietly. They come wrapped in second chances. They come to those who are willing to love without a plan. And now, at last, she was ready, not to teach him, but to learn from what they were building together, because some of the most powerful lessons are whispered between two chairs and a blackboard in the corner of an old prairie house. Where silence finds home. The morning sun slipped gently across the wooden floor, casting two long shadows on the blackboard, one tall, one small. The house was still. No grand farewell, no dramatic end, just the soft clink of a teacup set down, the rustle of paper as the boy adjusted his sketchbook, and the quiet warmth of another day beginning like every day before it, like every day to come. And then a voice hers spoke softly, more to herself than to him. Silence isn't the end of the story. It's where the real one begins. She didn't need to say more, because in that stillness, in that light, in that home carved out of grief and gentleness, something had taken root, something that didn't need noise to be understood. Because when someone is finally willing to sit with you in your silence, to wait, not rush, not fix, then even the quietest child can find the courage to speak. Maybe not loudly, maybe not today, but surely one day. And when that day comes, it won't be a surprise. It'll be the most natural thing in the world. In the end, it wasn't a courtroom, a signature, or even a name that saved them. It was a word. One small word teacher spoken not out of habit, but out of hope. Because healing doesn't always begin with answers. Sometimes it begins with someone who stays. Edelyn thought she had nothing left to teach. The boy thought he had no voice to be heard. Together, they proved both wrong. Which moment in this story struck you the most? Was it the silence? The first word? The choice to stay? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments. We read every one. And if this story stirred something in you, please like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales for more quiet stories that speak loudly to the heart. As this story fades to quiet, here's something to carry with you. Who in your life waited for your silence before they heard your truth?